Hello historians, today we're going to be looking at the 100 Years' War, which is quite an interesting name because it wasn't 100 years long, it was actually 116 years from 1337 to 1453. It was a series of wars, battles if you like, fought between the English and the French, and it was fought in France for land in France. Because remember the English kings had descended from the Normans who were French, and they felt that they still should run France as well as England, I suppose. So the battles took place over their 116 years. Obviously not between the same people. It just went on and on. Different generations fought more battles for 116 years. And there were several famous battles that you may have heard of during the course of that, and several famous iconic people that emerged as heroes and villains during that time. At the beginning of the 100 Years' War, England owned a small amount of France. And I've put a map, there's some maps on your PowerPoint so you can see, but I don't know if you can see this, I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if you can see, that's the black bit there is what, don't even know if you can see that, but the black bit there is what England owned of France at the beginning of the war. Okay, and now I'm going to show you if it works, hopefully. So at the beginning of the war, they owned that much of France, and then they actually got quite a lot more of France, and you can see there's a larger part at the bottom and then a little bit at the top. Then they lost nearly all of it. Then they got that bit back, the top of it back, and by the end of the war, they only had that much. Well, none at all, apart from the town of Calais. So I don't know if you could see that or not, but hopefully you could. So you can see the wars took different turns at different times, and I'm not going to waffle on for too long about it. I can't possibly tell you everything that happened in 116 years, so I'm just going to point you to a few famous battles and a few famous people. Now, to start with, the English did really well because the English had the longbow. Now, we've talked about the longbow before with the conquest of Wales and in Scotland. So the English were brilliant at using the longbow, and the French didn't actually use it. The French still fought on horseback, and the wars were mainly waged by the knights because the knights would be on horseback. But remember, if you were a knight on horseback, you'd have a really big, heavy armour on, and you weren't very flexible or agile. So you would be quite slow and cumbersome, and it's really heavy. You'd have your chainmail, then your armour, you'd have to carry your weapons, and you'd be riding a horse. So that's how the French started off fighting, on the horseback, and the English had their longbow. Remember, the longbows were huge, bigger than a doorway, and the archers could shoot loads of arrows in a very short space of time. So they'd stick their arrows in the ground in front of them, and they'd probably have a bit of a barricade in front of them as well. And then they'd shoot, fire, and then they could pick one up straight away, fire it again, pick one up, fire it again. And they were very successful. And also these arrows probably could, I don't know if they could pierce armour, but they could certainly do a lot of damage to the people they hit. And they were really successful in stopping the French who were on their big horses. So the first few battles, the famous Battle of Crécy and Poitiers, the English bowmen destroyed much larger French armies. Because they were fighting on foot, they were more agile, they could dodge in and out, and they had their bowmen, so they were much better. Then the Black Death came along, which was a horrible plague, which stopped the fighting for a few years because it was killing people anyway, on both sides. And then there were a few more battles, and you'd find that the English people were living in France, and they were not fighting because their fighting had stopped, but they ended up raiding villages, and they just didn't get a very good name for themselves anyway. Now, quite a long time later, so remember the war started in 1337, so nearly 100 years later, in 1415, we get a new, very famous king who you may have heard of called Henry V. Lots of films made about him. Shakespeare's written a play about him, and he was a very great leader, and he won an extremely famous battle you may have heard of called Agincourt, the Battle of Agincourt. And he won back that large part of the top of France that we looked at earlier. Unfortunately, he died very young, and he didn't continue his leadership because he died. And then, following on from him, 7 years after the Battle of Agincourt, we get a very interesting young lady called Joan of Arc. Now, Joan, she was 16. She was a peasant girl. She was a sheep. She looked after sheep. She couldn't read or write, but God spoke to her. She was a French girl. God said to her, "You're gonna beat the English and get the English out of France." Now, this is really brilliant. I love this story because she's this peasant girl. She's got no education at all, and she has got such belief that God has told her that she's going to win the battles and get rid of the English, that she goes to the French prince and says, "I'm going to lead you into battle and we're going to beat the English." Now, she must have been an amazing person to be able to do that, or have huge self-belief, because firstly, she was a girl, which girls don't go into battle anyway. She had no education. She was a peasant. I don't even know how she managed to get to speak to the prince, because that, I can't imagine how that would have happened. Anyway, she did manage to do it, and she did somehow manage to persuade him that she could lead his army, even though she had no training. She wasn't a fighter at all. As I said, she was a shepherdess. And she cut her hair short, she got some armour, and she did lead the French into lots of battles, and she did get rid of the English from France for quite a while. They didn't completely go, and unfortunately, she ended up being captured by the English, even after she'd won all of these battles and they were gone from most of the country. They did manage to capture her, and the French prince didn't do anything about it, which is dreadfully sad, I think, because he didn't want to be associated with her. Lots of people said she was a witch because she'd done all these amazing things, and how could a peasant woman, do all of those things? So he let the English take her. She was imprisoned by the English for about a year, and they didn't really know what to do with her. They obviously wanted to get rid of her, and they found a loophole how they could get rid of her. Because she'd cut her hair and she'd worn armour, she dressed as a boy, as a man, and they decided that she must be a witch because she was wearing men's clothes, and that's how they managed to get round killing her. And what they did, they charged her with wearing men's clothes, which is, can you imagine today? And they burnt her at the stake. And now the legend has it that she was only 19 when she was burned at the stake. She'd done this huge amount of things in such a short space of time. Now the legend has it that after her body was burned, her heart was still beating in the embers of the fire. Anyway, the French, they kept her spirit with them, I suppose, and they managed to, even after she died and the French prince had kind of disowned her, they still managed to win, and they got rid of the English from nearly all of France apart from Calais. And yeah, so Joan managed to do all of that in a very short space of time. So what an amazing woman. Brilliant. 23 years after she died, the English had all gone from France apart from Calais. So I think that's quite amazing, actually. That's the 100 Years' War in a nutshell. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of things I haven't told you about the 100 Years' War, but that's it very briefly. Now, the next thing I'd like you to do is to go click onto the website that I've given you, and they're going to give you some more information. You can read all of the information, or you can, if you scroll down to the bottom, it says have it read for you. Click on there and it will read it aloud. You can read it while this American lady reads it with you, and there's a quiz you can do. So I don't need to know your answers to the quiz, but if you just do the quiz online, and then I would like you to write down 5 facts that you've learnt about the 100 Years' War, and you can then, and that's what I'd like you to do today, is send me your 5 facts. Okay, that's it from me for today. Be brilliant.